There is a woman everyone in her town would have described, without a second of hesitation, as the calmest person they had ever met. She was the one they called when two neighbors stopped speaking, when a marriage was coming apart at the seams, when a meeting threatened to turn into a war. She could sit in a room thick with other people's fury and lower the temperature simply by being there. For 20 years, she was the still point that 100 storms revolved around. And then one ordinary afternoon, over something small, she detonated. Not a raised voice, a scorched earth, bridge-burning, take-no-prisoners eruption that left everyone who knew her standing in the wreckage, asking the same stunned question. Where did that come from? They did not understand what you are about to understand, that the calm was not the opposite of that explosion. The calm was the thing that had been charging it, quietly, for 20 years. Carl Jung spent his life studying this exact reversal, and he gave it a name that sounds like a spell, because in a way it is one. He understood something almost no one wants to hear, that the trait you are most proud of, the virtue you have built your whole identity around, is very often the secret battery slowly charging its own opposite. The patient person is charging an eruption. The endlessly giving person is charging a refusal that will frighten everyone. The one who never gets angry is filling a reservoir, drop by drop, behind a dam they swear will hold forever. It always holds, right up until the afternoon it does not. By the end of this, you will know the precise law that governs this swing, why your strongest quality is the one most likely to betray you, and why the people who admire you most are watching a pendulum they cannot see has already been pulled all the way back. You will understand what was really happening in all those years you thought you were simply being good. But there is a part Jung would have you sit with that is harder than the explosion itself. The eruption is not the failure. The eruption is the bill. The failure happened decades earlier, quietly, in the moment you decided that one half of yourself was acceptable and the other half had to be held underwater for the rest of your life. And the swing, when it finally comes, is not your character breaking. It is the half you drowned, coming up for air the only way you ever left it. If this is already touching something in you, the part of you that suspects your own patience has a price tag you have not yet been handed. I want you to stay with it. In the comments, before we go further, name the virtue you are proudest of, the one everyone praises you for. Just name it, the way you would name a thing you are watching carefully. Because by the end of this, you may see that the quality you trust the most is the one quietly keeping the bill. And if this is reaching something real, leave a like so it finds the next person who has been holding a dam shut and calling it peace. Send it to the one in your life who never seems to get angry. They, more than anyone, need to hear what comes next. Let me tell you about her properly, because her story is the whole map. Call her a mediator, because that is what the town called her, and what she called herself. For 2 decades, it was not just her job, it was her identity. The deepest thing she believed about who she was. She was the patient one, the reasonable one, the one who could always see the other side, who never let a disagreement curdle into a fight, who absorbed the heat of a room before it could scorch anyone. If you had asked her what she valued most in herself, she would have answered instantly, my patience, my ability to stay calm when everyone else loses it. She wore that calm the way other people wear a face. It was, she was certain, the truest thing about her. And it worked. That is what made it so hard to see. The calm was rewarded constantly, lavishly, from every direction. People praised her for it. They called her wise, unflappable, the grown-up in the room. Couples on the edge of divorce thanked her with tears in their eyes. Her colleagues marveled at how nothing ever seemed to get to her. Every time she swallowed her own irritation to soothe someone else's, the world told her she had done something noble. And so she did it again and again, until the swallowing was no longer a choice she made, but a reflex she could not feel herself performing. She polished that patience until it shone. She never once noticed that the more it was praised, the heavier the thing behind it grew. This is where Jung hands us the first piece of the map, and it begins with the part of you the world sees. He spent decades studying what he called the persona, the mask we construct to meet the world, the version of ourselves we present at the door of every room. The persona is not a lie. We all wear one, and there is nothing shameful in it. It is the handshake between the private self and the public world, the face that says, "Here is who you can count on me to be." The mediator's persona had a very particular shape. She was patience itself, composed, endlessly understanding. And the danger of the persona, Jung warned, is not that we wear one. The danger is that we forget we are wearing it. We become identical with the mask. We mistake the costume for the skin. She had worn calm for so long that she no longer believed it was something she was doing. She believed it was simply completely who she was. But a mask that only ever shows one face has to put the other faces somewhere. And this is the move almost everyone misses, the entire key to her story and very possibly to yours. When you commit totally to being one thing, you do not delete its opposite. You exile it. The mediator had built an identity on never being the source of conflict, which meant that every flash of her own anger, every selfish want, every moment of "I do not actually care about your problem right now," had to be taken and pushed down into the dark because it did not fit the person she had decided to be. Jung called that dark place the shadow, and he was clear about what fills it. Not evil, not the worst of you, simply the rejected of you, the disowned half. The traits you were told, by the world or by your own ideal, were unacceptable. The mediator's shadow did not fill up with cruelty. It filled up with her own refused anger, her own buried no, her own right to take up space and be displeased and stop carrying everyone. The more perfectly patient she became on the surface, the more pressure built in the basement, and no one, least of all her, was watching the gauge. Here is the law that governs everything that follows, and it is the most important idea in this entire story. Jung borrowed it from an ancient Greek who lived 25 centuries ago, a philosopher named Heraclitus, and he called it enantiodromia. The word is heavy, but the idea is brutally simple. Anything pushed far enough toward one extreme will eventually turn into its own opposite. The pendulum that you pull all the way to one side does not stay there. It cannot. The further you pull it, the more violently it will swing back the other way. Jung observed this everywhere, in individuals and in whole nations. The tendency of a one-sided attitude held too long to suddenly and shockingly reverse into its contrary. The man of relentless reason has a breakdown into pure feeling. The saint discovers a capacity for sin that horrifies him. And the mediator who has been the calmest person in town for 20 years one day becomes the most volcanic, and everyone who watches it happen thinks they are seeing a stranger. They are not. They are seeing the other end of the same pendulum, arriving exactly on schedule. Let me give this its name, the one I want you to carry out of here. I call it the charging pole. Every virtue you hold to an unconscious extreme becomes a charging pole, quietly building a voltage of its exact opposite somewhere out of sight, until the charge is too great to hold and it discharges all at once with an intensity that matches everything you suppressed. The mediator's patience was a charging pole. 20 years of swallowed anger does not vanish. It accumulates. It waits. And the size of the eventual eruption is not random. It is precisely the sum of every no she never said, every boundary she dissolved to keep the peace, every storm she absorbed so that no one else would have to feel it. She did not have a bad day. She paid in a single afternoon a debt she had been running up for 2 decades without ever seeing the statement. To understand how the dam got built in the first place, you have to go back, as you almost always do, to a room you had no power to leave. Jung understood that we do not arrive in adulthood as blank slates. We arrive already shaped, already trained, carrying the deep internal imprint of the first people who held our survival in their hands. The child studies those people the way a sailor studies weather, because the weather decides everything, and the child learns, with breathtaking intelligence, exactly which parts of itself bring warmth and which parts bring the cold. The mediator grew up in a house with a volatile parent, a father whose anger filled every room like a pressure change you could feel in your teeth before you ever heard a sound. A door slammed, a voice rose, and the whole house held its breath. And the child made a discovery that would organize the rest of her life. She learned that anger, any anger, was the most dangerous force in the universe because she had watched what it did. She learned that her only safety lay in being the one who never added to the heat, the one who soothed, who smoothed, who absorbed. She became, at 8 years old, the family's mediator, reading her father's footsteps in the hallway to know which version of him was coming home, diffusing her mother's panic, translating everyone's fury into something quieter so the house would not catch fire. She was breathtakingly good at it. And in becoming that good at it, she made a private vow that she was far too young to know she was making. I will never be like that. I will never let my own anger out. I will be the opposite of the thing that terrified me. And that vow, that beautiful, life-saving, devastating vow, is the moment the dam was poured. Because here is the part that is hard to forgive yourself for. So let me reframe it before it lands wrong. She did not bury her anger because she was weak. She buried it because burying it worked. It kept her safe in a house where anger meant danger. It was not a flaw. It was genius. The most adaptive thing a frightened child in that house could possibly have done. The tragedy is not that she did it. The tragedy is that no one ever told her the war was over, that the house she was protecting against had burned down decades ago, and she was still, every single day, holding a hose on the ashes. Because here is what nobody warns you about the strategies that save the child. They do not retire when the danger passes. They calcify into the identity of the adult. The girl who learned that her anger was a house fire grew up to be the woman everyone called the calmest person they knew. And every compliment she received for it drove the vow a little deeper into the bedrock. They praised the absence of her anger, and so she became more certain than ever that the anger had to stay gone. She did not just suppress one feeling. She built an entire self on its suppression, a self the whole town came to depend on. A self that earned its love precisely by guaranteeing it would never, ever swing the other way. But the law of the pendulum does not care how good your reasons are, and once the charge gets high enough, it begins to leak. Long before it ever fully erupts, in ways you would never connect to the thing you are holding down. Jung understood that what you push into the shadow does not lie there quietly. Energy denied a conscious outlet does not evaporate. It goes underground and it comes out sideways. For the mediator, the leaking showed up first as exhaustion, a bone-deep fatigue that no amount of rest could touch, the particular tiredness of a body that is using a huge portion of its strength every single day to hold a door shut. It showed up as a flatness, a sense of watching her own life from behind glass, because to suppress one big feeling you have to turn down the volume on all of them. It showed up as resentments she did not understand, sudden flares of irritation at strangers that were far too large for what they had done, the charge arcing out through the smallest gaps it could find. She thought the tiredness was just the cost of being a caring person. It was actually the cost of standing guard around the clock for 20 years over a self she had condemned without trial. And then came the afternoon. It was nothing really that set it off, which is exactly how the pendulum works. A small request, the kind she had granted 10,000 times. Someone asking her, once again, to absorb their problem, to smooth a thing over, to be the reasonable one while they got to be upset. And something that had been held all the way back for 2 decades simply let go. Everything she had never said came out at once, and it did not come out clean or wise or measured. It came out the way floodwater comes through a broken dam, indiscriminate, taking the good with the bad, scouring everything in its path. She said things that were true and things that were only the pressure talking. She burned a relationship that mattered to her completely in the space of a few minutes. And the most disorienting part, the part she could not make sense of afterward, was that some buried thing inside her felt, for one terrible moment, relieved, as if a part of her that had been drowning for 20 years had finally, violently broken the surface. This is the moment everyone misreads, including her, and the misreading is the whole danger. Standing in the wreckage, she told herself the obvious story. I lost control. I am not myself. That was not me. And that sentence, that was not me, is the exact sentence that guarantees the swing will happen again, because it sends the very part that just surfaced right back down into the dark, more pressurized than before. The eruption was not the alien intruder she thought it was. It was the most native thing in her. It was the anger of a small girl who had been told her whole life that she did not get to have it, finally, catastrophically, taking what it had been denied. She was furious at the explosion, but the explosion was just the messenger. The message had been written 20 years ago, and the return address was her own basement. Jung saw this same law operating far beyond any single life, and it is worth pausing on, because once you understand the swing in yourself, you begin to recognize it everywhere, in couples, in families, in whole nations. He watched a culture that prided itself on reason and order suddenly convulse into mass irrationality, and he understood it as enantiodromia on a collective scale, the over-civilized surface charging the barbarism beneath it until the whole thing reversed. The principle does not change with size. A family that forbids all conflict raises the child who eventually blows the family apart. A community that insists on relentless niceness breeds the cruelty that leaks out in whispers and exclusions. Anywhere a group worships one pole and pretends the other does not exist, the other is not gone. It is charging, underground, gathering exactly the voltage of everything that was denied. The mediator was the perfect carrier of this, because a town that needed someone to hold all its calm had found in her someone willing to hold all of it, which meant she was also, without anyone choosing it on purpose, the one quietly storing all of its unspoken rage. When she finally erupted, she was not only discharging her own 20 years, in a way no one would ever name, she was discharging theirs. Let me show you the other end of this, because there is a second way the law catches people, and it is just as common. Picture a man, call him Thomas, who was the mediator's exact opposite from the start. Where she had built her identity on never being angry, he had built his on never being weak, tough, decisive, allergic to anything soft, the man who handled everything and felt nothing, who treated tenderness the way she treated rage, as a danger to be amputated. For decades it worked for him the way the calm worked for her. And then, in his late 50s, after a loss he could not muscle his way past, Thomas swung. The man who had never cried in his adult life came apart so completely that he could barely function, drowning in a grief and a neediness that horrified him, certain he had lost his mind. He had not lost his mind. He had simply hit the far wall of his own pendulum. The hardness he was proudest of had been charging an equal and opposite softness the whole time, and when the charge finally released, it released as a flood, exactly as hers had, only the water was made of everything he had refused to feel instead of everything she had refused to say. Two opposite virtues, two opposite people, the identical law. Whatever you will not consciously hold, you will one day be unable to stop from holding all at once. And once you understand the pendulum, you cannot unsee it anywhere, because here is what Jung wants you to grasp about the swing. Going to the other extreme is not freedom, it is the trap. After the eruption, the mediator faced a fork that everyone in her position faces, and both obvious paths are disasters. The first temptation is the one she reached for instinctively in her shame. Clamp down harder, reinforce the dam, apologize, suppress, swear it will never happen again, and go back to being the calmest person in town. Only now with the gauge buried even deeper. But you already know where that road leads. A dam built higher does not solve the flood. It only guarantees that the next one will be bigger. The second temptation is more seductive, and it is the one Jung mapped with chilling precision. Having tasted the power in her own anger, having felt how alive that eruption made her after decades of flatness, a voice in her began to whisper that maybe the patience itself was the lie. Maybe the explosion was the real her, finally free. Maybe from now on she should stop being a doormat, stop absorbing everyone's storms, start saying every hard thing the moment she felt it, become the woman no one dares to lean on again. And that feels, for a while, like liberation. It is not. It is just the pendulum, parked at the far end of its arc instead of the near one. The mediator who spent her life as the absorber does not become free by becoming the eruptor. She just trades one extreme for its mirror image and hands the people who shaped her exactly what they always had, total control over her shape, only now in reverse. The patient self was bent away from her own anger. The volatile self would be bent away from her own peace. Either way, the wound is still holding the pen. Either way, she is not living, she is reacting, swinging between two walls she never chose. This is the part you were not supposed to survive into, because the new extreme feels so much like an answer that almost no one questions it. She could so easily have spent her second act as the woman who finally tells everyone off, mistaking volatility for honesty, raging where she used to soothe, and calling it growth. And she would have been just as run by that childhood house as she ever was. She would simply have stopped serving the old fear by appeasing it, and started serving it by becoming it. The shadow that erupts and seizes the throne does not heal you. It just gives the pendulum a new wall to slam into. And a life spent swinging between drowning your anger and being drowned by it is not two different lives. It is one prison with two cells, and you hold the only key in your own hand the entire time. If you have felt this, the violent swing after years of being too soft, or the lurch back into clamping down after you finally let something out, I want you to do something with it before it runs away with you. In the comments, write the two poles you swing between, not as a confession, but as a map. The patient one and the explosive one. The giver and the one who finally refuses. The peacemaker and the bridge burner. Whatever your two walls turned out to be, name them both, because the part of you that can see the whole arc is the part that can finally step off it. And if this is reaching something true in you, leave a like so it finds the next person standing in their own wreckage, certain they are broken. Send it to the one who swings, the one whose patience you have learned to brace yourself against. They will know exactly what this is. So if the answer is not the higher dam, and it is not the open floodgate, what is it? Jung gave the way out, and it is the most difficult and the most important psychological operation a person can perform, because it is not a swing in either direction. It is standing still in the middle and holding both ends at once. The mediator's task was never to choose between the patient woman and the furious one. It was to stop letting them take turns possessing her, and instead bring them into the same room, consciously, on purpose, and let them learn to live together. Jung called the thing that is born from this the transcendent function, and he said it emerges only when you refuse to let the opposites inside you fight for the throne and hold them both in tension long enough for a genuine third thing to appear, something neither pole could ever have reached alone. For her, the third thing did not look like serenity, and it did not look like fury. It looked like a woman who could finally feel her anger as it arrived, in real time, in ordinary small doses, instead of saving it all up for a once-in-a-decade flood. This is the move the pendulum can never make. The dam holds nothing back until it holds nothing back at all. But a river with an open channel runs steadily, every day, never accumulating the lethal pressure in the first place. The mediator learned to say the small no in the moment, so she never again had to scream the enormous one years later. She learned that a little anger, felt and expressed as it comes, is the very thing that makes the catastrophic anger unnecessary. The feeling she had spent her whole life treating as a house fire turned out to be, in conscious daily doses, simply information. It told her where her limits were. It told her when something was wrong. It gave her the force to hold a line she could see clearly instead of dissolving it and resenting the dissolution. Her anger, integrated, did not make her dangerous. It made her honest. But I have to be honest with you about what this actually looked like, because the word balance makes it sound like a single, graceful adjustment, and it was nothing of the kind. It was 100 clumsy moments, most of them awkward and some of them ugly. The first time she let a small, honest no out into the open, it came out too sharp, overcorrected, with 20 years of back pressure behind a sentence that should have been mild. She heard the eruptor's voice come out of her mouth where she had only meant to set a calm boundary, and the old shame rushed in, and she lurched back toward the dam. Then she caught herself clamping down and lurched the other way. The reclaimed feeling does not return polished. It comes back the age it was buried, a furious 8-year-old who has been underwater for decades, and you cannot simply hand that child the keys to your adult life. You have to raise it. You have to let it speak, and then teach it, slowly, how to speak in a way that builds instead of burns. Conscious balance is not a destination you arrive at once. It is the pause before you answer, the half-second in which you ask whether this calm is real peace or just the old reflex damming the river again. and whether this sharpness is a true boundary or just the pressure venting. Every time she chose consciously, the middle grew a little more solid under her feet, until one day standing there was no longer a struggle. It was simply how she stood. And here is where the cost I described earlier began, quietly, to be repaid. The relationships in her life started to change, because a person who can be honestly displeased in small, survivable amounts is a person you can actually know. For years, people had related to a surface, a guaranteed calm that revealed nothing real, and they had felt, without being able to name it, that they could never quite reach her. Now she would tell them, plainly and early, when something did not sit right before it could grow into a reservoir. It made her, at first, harder to manage. It also made her, for the first time, possible to genuinely meet. The people who had loved the surface were sometimes thrown by the depth, but the ones capable of real relationship found, where there had once been a perfect, unreadable composure, an actual human being, with edges and preferences and a quiet capacity to say, "That does not work for me," and to say it before it ever became a flood. Watch how this looked in a single, ordinary moment, because the breakthrough is quieter than the eruption and infinitely stronger. Months into the work, the same kind of request arrived that had triggered the flood, someone leaning on her, expecting her to absorb a problem that was not hers and stay pleasant about it. She felt both poles rise at once, the old reflex to smile and swallow and dissolve herself into the role, and the new, hot pull to finally say every withheld thing and let it scorch. She felt both, and for the first time she obeyed neither. She waited. She let the tension sit in her chest without rushing to discharge it in either direction. And then she said, in a voice that was perfectly level, "No, not this time. That one is yours to carry. No flood after it. No apology softening it into a joke. No raised voice either. Just the word, set down like a stone. And a silence she did not rush to fill. The patient woman would have folded. The eruptor would have detonated. The woman who said that sentence was neither, and she was both, and she was something the pendulum had never once allowed her to be. Steady, awake, whole. There was one more thing she had to do, and it was the hardest, because it took her back to the house where the dam was first poured. She did not need to confront the volatile parent of her childhood, and she did not need to absolve him, because both of those would have been performances, and she was done performing. She needed only to understand, all the way down in her body, that the small girl's vow had been answered by a danger that no longer existed. The terror that built the dam was real, and it mattered, and it had kept her alive. But she was not 8 anymore, in a house where anger meant catastrophe. She was an adult, in her own life, where a feeling honestly expressed was simply a feeling, not a fire. And the grief of all the years she had spent guarding against a fire that had long since gone out was real. But underneath the grief was something steadier. The quiet understanding that she was finally free to set the hose down. Now we can return to where this began and see it with new eyes. You cannot dam a river by pretending it isn't there. You only choose where it floods. That is the law. And it does not bend for your virtue, your reputation, or your 2 decades of being the calmest person in the room. The water you refuse to acknowledge does not disappear. It pools, it rises, and one ordinary afternoon it decides for you where the break will be. The mediator spent 20 years believing she had no river, that her patience was a fact of her nature rather than a wall she was straining to hold, and the river chose its own moment and its own banks to overflow, and it took down a bridge she loved. The work was never to build the wall higher, and it was never to tear it down and let the whole reservoir loose at once. The work was to dig a channel, to let the water move a little every day, in the open, where she could see it and direct it, so that it never again had to choose for her. And notice what this story refuses to tell you, because it would be a lie. It does not say her patience was bad, or that her years of soothing the people around her meant nothing. They meant a great deal. The gift was real, but a gift held to an unconscious extreme stops being a gift and becomes a fuse. It does not say she should feel ashamed of the eruption either, as though more shame, more suppression were the answer, when shame is the very pressure that built the charge. What is true is quieter and harder than either. The explosion was not a failure of her character. It was the predictable, lawful return of a half of herself she had spent a lifetime drowning, arriving the only way she ever left it any room to arrive, all at once and out of control. And the freedom was never in choosing the better pole. It was in finally stepping off the pendulum altogether and learning to stand, on purpose, in the living tension of the middle. So here is the thing this whole story has been moving toward. The trait you are proudest of and the trait you are most ashamed of are not strangers to each other. They are the two ends of a single arc, and the further you pull toward the one you love, the harder the one you fear is being drawn back to strike. You will not save yourself by becoming more patient, or more honest, or more anything in a single direction. You will save yourself by refusing to pick a wall to slam into, and instead holding both poles in your two hands, consciously every day in small and unglamorous amounts, until the violent swing simply has nothing left to discharge. The river was always going to move. The only question Jung ever leaves you with is whether you will keep being shocked by where it floods, or finally take up the work of choosing. If something in this opened a door onto your own swing, the high you pay for in a later low, the calm you pay for in a later storm, do not rush to dam it back up. Sit with the whole arc. You do not have to fix it all at once. You only have to stop being surprised by it. And if you want to keep walking through the rest of Jung's map of the self you exiled, room by room, follow along, because we are only at the fifth door. There are more ahead, and each one hands you back another piece of the person you already are. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.